raced across the sea, seeking safety from the disaster that engulfed their island. Men, women, and children and animals looked back in fear. Beyond the foamy wake of their ships, they could see a plume of smoke and ash rising into the sky, spreading out against the horizon as it hit the atmosphere. The flashes of light and sheets of flame illuminate the ash. Some of the passengers wept, reduced to tears at the sight of their homeland's devastation. Those in the first ships looked anxiously towards their leader. Marcus could save them, if anyone could. He had warned them of a coming disaster, had urged them to flee. He had supervised the building of ships and the loading of provisions for a voyage. Yet nobody really knew where they were bound, if they had any destination beyond a watery grave. None of the great sages had ever spoken of land beyond the southern horizon, yet that was the course Marcus had set for them. Days passed without any sign of land. Marcus kept watch at the bow, peering into the emptiness, trying to conceal his growing anxiety from those around him. Somewhere ahead there had to be an island that appeared on no maps. Above him the eagle circled, searching for signs of land, yet nothing had been seen. Marcus wondered, not for the first time, if he had been mistaken, but he squared his shoulders and kept his hardened eyes on the horizon. Everything depended on him. And we start with chapter 1. Once upon a time, an old house stood in the English town of Oxford. It was built close by the ancient city walls, ivy growing over its stonework and mullioned windows, and was the sort of place with lots of dark corners and hidden stairways. And in this house lived a professor, his wife, and an old tabby cat. The professor's special interest was reading about ancient battles, both at land and at sea. His ramshackle study was filled with paintings of famous naval engagements. The professor had never actually been to sea, but rather liked the idea of it, and no one was prouder when his son became a captain in the Royal British Navy. His wife was the cozy, grandmotherly sort of person who specializes in scrumptious teas and biscuits. She had jolly round cheeks and an enormous lap for children to fall into. On one particular day, not all that long ago, the house was all in a flurry of preparation for the arrival of two special visitors, their grandchildren. Their mother had died not quite a year ago, and with their father off at sea, they needed a place to spend the school holidays. The professor's wife had spent the morning in preparation, airing out sheets and blankets, sweeping floors, and dusting cabinets. The professor had spent the morning choosing interesting books to leave in the spare bedrooms. For Peter, aged 14, he had selected a history of Admiral Nelson's tactics at the Battle of Trafalgar. It had been a bit more difficult for him to find a suitable book for Julia, aged 13, but finally he chose a fine book on ancient Greek politics and left it on her bedside table. His wife saw it as she placed a vase of freshly cut flowers from the garden, wiped Julia's bed, and hastily replaced it with a copy of Alice in Wonderland. The children arrived that evening with all the ordinary bustle that completes a long journey. They were both hugged and kissed nearly to death, relieved of their bags, offered a vast assortment of fresh things, and shown to their rooms. Peter collapsed at once on top of his bed, not even bothering to undress, but Julia was tired. She washed, changed into a long nightgown, and sat on the edge of the bed, brushing her long hair absent-mindedly, and looked out through her window at a walled garden beneath her. She sighed deeply. Normally, it had been agreed she and Peter would be allowed to stay with friends during school breaks when their father was away. But this time, their father had shore leave and was coming home to see them. There was something he had to tell them. He'd said in his message. So Julia and Peter had been told to go straight from their boarding schools to the old house in Oxford. Their father would join them there as soon as his ship docked in Plymouth. Julia would have so much preferred to go to Lucy Honeybourne's home in Kent. They could have gone swimming together and maybe even gone shopping. in London for a day. She did love her grandparents, but they were so old-fashioned. Thank goodness they had finally left her alone for the night. She laid down the brush and leaned back on the pillow, ruffling idly through the pages of Alice in Wonderland, and listened to her brother's snores through the wall. Julia did not really like Peter very much. He was interested in things that bored her, like machines and gadgets and sport, and since they had both been sent off to school, they hardly ever saw each other. But she admitted to herself even Peter would be better company than her grandparents. The thought froze in her head as her eyes and ears fixed themselves on the old, ornate door. It was opening slowly, creaking as a beam of light marched across the floor. But a moment later she relaxed. The old tabby cat had entered her room and leapt onto the bed beside her. "Why, hello, Scamp." She lifted him up and tickled him under his chin. Scamp purred appreciatively. Both were glad to have some company. Julia walked to the window, scratching the tabby behind his ears as she went, and looked through the glass at the walled garden below, its fountain burbling gently. "Look at the garden," Scamp pressed a paw up against the cold pane and purred again. "Wouldn't you like to explore it? But you can't, because you're an inside cat, aren't you?" Scamp was not allowed outside the house in case he returned with fleas or freshly killed birds or mice. Julia's grandmother was horrified at the thought of any of these creatures, living or dead, getting inside her nice clean house. She also did not want Scamp mixing with any of the rough common cats that lived outside. He might learn some bad habits. Julia gave a wry smile. Poor Scamp, always trapped inside. Suddenly, something moved in the garden below. Some birds were fluttering around the fountain. Scamp instantly became alert, his muscles tensed, staring down into the garden at the birds. Julia noticed his interest in what lay below. "You'd like to get out there and have an adventure, wouldn't you? Well, I'm sorry, but you aren't allowed out. You just have to stay here." Julia dumped the old cat in her bed and watched him curl up into a ball and fall asleep. Making sure that Scamp did not follow her, she slid her feet into her blue slippers and descended the wooden staircase leading into the paneled hall. She wasn't tired. She was going to explore. The house was still and quiet, apart from the slow ticking of an old grandfather clock. It was the first time that Julia had ever been alone in the old house. She began to investigate, peeping into rooms that she was sure she was not meant to enter. She peeked into her grandfather's study. What a mess. Papers were lying all over the floor, and books were stacked high on his desk. There seemed to be a model of sailing ships on every shelf in the room. She shut the door quietly behind her and moved on to the drawing room. After half an hour, she had explored every room in the house. What now? Still wide awake, she loathed the idea of returning to the stuffy spare room. She was back in the hall. She ran her fingers along its ancient wooden panels. To her left was the front door leading towards the college. She had come through that door earlier when she had arrived. But there was another door to her right, half hidden by a heavy green curtain. She walked towards it and pushed the curtain aside. Did it lead down to the cellar? Or into the street? Making sure that Scamp was nowhere close, Julia slowly unlocked the door and began opening it. The heavy oak door creaked and groaned with the complaints of long disuse, and Julia froze. What if someone heard and came to investigate? Julia held her breath for a long moment, but there was only silence. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door completely to reveal a walled garden. It must be the same garden that she could see from her bedroom. Julia hesitated. Should she go in? She looked around quickly. Nobody was there. She entered the garden, closing the door as softly as she could behind her. It was a glorious evening in the month of May. Silver light flashed off the streams of water from the fountain in its center. The soft burbling of the fountain echoed off the walls, enfolding the garden in its gentle music. At the side of the fountain was a small pond fed by its own stream of water. The walls were covered by trees and climbing plants. Apple trees, wisteria, and magnolia were all in bloom, the night air heavy with their fragrance. It was the most beautiful garden Julia had ever seen. And then she heard a voice whisper her name, softly and slowly. A shiver shot down Julia's spine. As she whipped around, looking for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. "Stop being stupid," she told herself, and gave a determined shake of her head before hurrying back inside the house. It must have been the wind or birds or someone talking in the street beyond the garden walls. Julia closed the door softly behind her and returned to her room upstairs. Scamp was still curled up on the bed, and he stretched and flexed his paws as she turned back the covers and climbed in. It was an odd garden, she thought. Something wasn't right there. And yet it looked so beautiful outside her window now, glowing softly. Silvery trees, silvery paths, silvery water. The fountain and pool were shimmering in an eerie yet beautiful light. There was something odd about it, she thought to herself, but she couldn't quite work out what it was. Julia snuggled down beneath the covers, resolving to visit the garden again the next day. It was just as she finally fell asleep that she realized what was so strange about the garden. There had not been any moon that night. She woke the next morning to a pressure on her shoulder and opened her eyes to see Scamp kneading his paws against her. Julia grinned sleepily and tickled his ears. The tabby leapt off the bed and meowed at the door. "Ready for breakfast?" Julia asked her insistent companion. "I wouldn't mind a bit myself." Her grandmother was already at the table downstairs, sipping a cup of tea as she perused the morning mail. She smiled as Julia appeared and gestured at the seat next to her. "Good morning, my dear," she murmured. "And where is that rascal brother of yours this morning?" Her question was answered by a grunt. Peter lopped into the room, still in yesterday's clothes, and plunked himself into a seat. It was, Julia decided, a very long holiday. Breakfast was a tense affair. The children's grandmother tried to get Peter and Julia to talk about their schools and their hobbies, but, exhausting her arsenal of questions, she left the table and retreated into her quiet world of books and croquet. Peter asked permission to leave the house and explore Oxford, and Julia, delighted to be left in peace, took a book out to the garden that she had already begun to consider hers. And we will resume chapter 2 in the next video. Sorry if I got a little loud at some parts and I got too close to the mic. I try my best to try to keep a soft-speaking or quiet voice, but I do realize that I might have talked a little regularly at times, so I do apologize if it's not that appealing to the ears. I hope it was. I definitely enjoyed reading it. It was a very good read. If you haven't picked up a copy, I suggest it's a very good book, or at least it has a good start. I think it'll be a great book, but I guess we'll see when